Peter first visited Stonehenge when he was 42. It was a magic year for him. He'd been divorced the year before, and he was visiting the world to try to find himself again after all those years of unhappy marriage. Out to Salisbury Plain, he took a bus, a tourist bus. He wasn't much for tourists, kinds of things like that, but he didn't have any other way to get there easily. And so he thought this one time he'd take the bus out, one of those big tourist buses with 42 seats on each side and packed with tourists. And it wasn't really a pleasant way to see Stonehenge. But he made it pleasant because he skipped the trip back. He was so impressed with the place that he decided he'd spend a little more time there. And the only way to spend more time there, because the bus left after 2 hours, was to hop off. So he did. He wandered away from the group, and as they left, he went on
and walked back up to the rocks. He had always wanted to come to Stonehenge, and every single time he would make plans to travel to that part of the country across the ocean, something would get in the way. There would be some sort of barrier or boundary or mishap that kept him from being able to go and see what he thought was probably a very magical place. He had been in love with everything magical and mythical and fairy since he was a kid. He and his friends used to run down the creek banks and look underneath each rock and say that they were looking for salamanders and crawdads, but instead they were constantly looking for gnomes and fairies and anything that was magic that could come up and surprise them. And sometimes they would surprise each other by catching a crawdad by the tail and flinging it about and saying, "Look, it's a fairy," and then tossing it over their shoulder so no one could tell what it really was. And here he was. He finally got here. The last time that he wanted to come, it had been with his wife. And he had been so desperately in love and really thrilled that Anna Marie wanted to come to Stonehenge with him. But as the trip grew closer, her interest in the travel waned. And it seemed as well that her interest in him grew dim. He at the time had no idea why. But it became apparent that a trip at that point in their relationship was not going to go anywhere that either of them enjoyed. So he, being the shrewd man that he was, had gotten travel insurance and canceled the trip and was able not to lose what he had invested. Unless you count the relationship, because
the relationship was already going downhill all those years ago. It's funny that it was associated with Stonehenge, something that he had loved so much, and that his desire to see and his plans to see had seemed to spark something in Anne Marie that then just snowballed years on and kept her from ever loving him. I suppose that's why he was so excited to be at Stonehenge. He could finally have this thing that meant so much to him and that it caused him so much pain in his marriage. So as the bus pulled away, he started to circumnavigate Stonehenge, walking around and around slowly, getting as close as he could to the stones, not crossing the fencing, of course, inside. Or he was sure they would have security cameras up or drones or something watching him, so they couldn't do that. But he thought if he walked enough, he'd get really the sense of this place. And so he walked on into the evening, pulling a little meat pie out of his pocket for dinner. It wasn't a very substantial dinner, but it was what he had, and he was satisfied as he walked with that. And so he walked on into the night until it was midnight. And then
he started to feel sleepy. It didn't really surprise him. It was, after all, midnight, and he was very grateful that it was clear. And though it had grown a little bit chilly, he had a jacket and didn't feel like he was in too much danger of being too cold. He was a bit surprised at himself from staying there for so long. As much as he was interested in magic, he also had a very realistic streak, and it was not like him not to have somewhere to go for the night. But he felt almost compelled to stay in that place. So he sat down outside the fence, although the thought of crossing inside at this point at midnight did cross his mind. And he thought maybe he would rest his eyes for just a bit. He was somewhat satiated from his meat pie, and he knew that if he waited until he got hungry again, he might not be able to doze at all. And so Peter fell into a deep sleep. The moon was high, and it was a new moon. So although it was dark, in that the moon did not shine, the stars were extraordinarily bright. And at some point, way past 2 or 3, Peter awoke with a start. And he thought he felt someone's presence with him. He was not afraid, but he was interested. He stood up from his spot of rest, and he looked all the way across Stonehenge. And he thought he saw a little cloaked man, followed by what seemed to be fireflies. How odd, he thought. Someone else out here just like me. I think I'll go and talk to them. And so he began to walk around the fencing again. But it seemed as each time he walked, it was as though the other person could see him and kept exactly across from him in the space. Peter decided that maybe he would call out to them, that he would risk it. And he shot up his hand and called.
Hello! 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 And eventually, after many hellos, the figure turned slightly and looked toward him. And that sense of fireflies around him kind of settled. So there was just this white figure across Stonehenge, standing and, well, not really facing Peter, but turning slightly in his direction. And then the strangest thing happened. Later, Peter could not really explain it. Couldn't really tell anyone how. When this dog walked up, it appeared to go right through the figure, just as if he wasn't there. But Peter had seen him clearly and could still see him. And he had turned toward Peter when he called. So he knew he was there, but this dog, this big, female dog with tits hanging down, like she had just whelped pups and was nursing them, had walked up beside this man, or this woman, for in fact, he didn't know if it was a man or a woman, and then right through them. He didn't know what to think.
Except he had the strange sensation that he should be afraid, and he was not. He, in fact, had never felt more calm or at peace or in place. He, all at once, knew that every time he was unable to come to Stonehenge, it had been exactly as it should be. Because if he had made this trip sometime in the past, he may not be here now. And this is the trip that Peter needed to take. He no longer was afraid about crossing the fence. He no longer thought that there were drones or security that might catch him in the moment. Because somehow he believed that he had crossed into some dimension that was beyond security and drones flying overhead. And he crossed completely across Stonehenge, all the way to the other side, with a figure just standing there. Some glow settled down around it, and this large dog standing beside it. The dog took no mind of the figure, in fact, as if it did not even see it was there. And as the figure moved away from Stonehenge, Peter knew to follow. The dog trotted at Peter's side. Peter was not hungry as he expected to be. In fact, he was full and satiated, as if the meat pie had fed everything that he needed. His only concern was if he followed the figure to wherever it was leading, if he would be able to make his way back, or if he would be taken to wherever he was being led and need to make a choice, like in one of those choose your own adventure books, and not be able to unmake it. And yet he followed. And as he walked, he began to talk to the figure as if the figure would reply. He somehow knew that it would not. Wow, this is a very fine night. I'm so glad this is the night I decided to come here. I'm so glad to meet you. Your name is? No reply. This is also a very fine dog. Is this your dog? No reply. And he went on like that for quite some time, just to hear his own self talk, so that he wouldn't feel lonely with the dog and the stranger. And eventually he saw a structure in the distance, and he knew that's where they were heading. He checked in with himself, and again, no fear. And they continued their walk, him being led and the dog at his side. And then,
as they approached the chamber or the structure, Peter realized that it was a cairn, a burial chamber, a stone mound. For some, even today, think that Stonehenge was somehow associated with burials. And here he was now approaching with this figure on his side, a fully formed and apparently ancient burial chamber, burial cairn. Well, he didn't have time to wonder at this, for the figure, when it came up, it walked down into the central passage and down into the cairn. And the dog sat down at the outside, as if waiting. Peter wasn't sure what to do, but he had come this far. If the figure was leading him, he should follow it. He should follow it on. He still wasn't afraid. And so he went down in a step at a time because it was dark. It was very dark outside, and even darker as he went down the passage. He had on his keychain a small little light that he would use sometimes to find his keys or his doorknob in the dark so he could put his keys in. And he turned it on. It was dim, or he rarely used it, but it provided enough light that he didn't fall down the sloping passage to the center chamber. You could call it a chamber, really a crossways between two side passages. He turned down the right passage, but it was soon a dead end, and there was nothing there. And so he went back to the central crossing point and turned down the left passage, but it soon ended, and there was nothing there. So he turned and he went down the center passage. It wasn't much longer. And it ended blindly too, but here there was a great solid stone set vertically in the wall. And on that stone there were strange runes covered. Peter couldn't read them, but he reached out his hand and ran it along those runes, and he seemed to understand something of what they said.
And the thought that this was exactly the time that he needed to be in this place was confirmed. Peter's boyhood love of all things magic had led him to this place. Although he could not read it, he felt the stone tell him that he had purpose, and that indeed there was magic in the world, and that he had followed it here. And that although this was one of the places on the planet that you would need to be initially connected to the spirit and magic of the universe, that once one found themselves to this place, that they would be able to take part of it with them as they lived through the rest of their life. The stone also seemed to speak directly to him, because it also told him that the dog waiting at the cave at the cairn entrance was to be his dog. And that if he could not find a way to take the dog wherever he was going, then he was not to go. This was a little hard for Peter, since he really planned on getting home in a week's time. And he had some idea that figuring out travel for the dog might take longer than that. But Peter had felt off course since Anne-Marie broke his heart. And he knew that anything that felt this safe and calm might be able to get him back, give him back his rudder, set him back on his path. And he felt something that he had not felt in a long time. A small flicker of faith. And for him, this was enough.
And so when he turned back and began to walk up the cairn and out into the moonlight, or in this night, really the lack of moon, or it was a new moon, he felt that faith and hope in the future. And he kept it when he woke up next to the fence at Stonehenge, stiff and groggy and even somewhat cranky. Until he turned and looked at his side, And there was the dog.